Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kirk Daly. I work for DPI Fisheries as a manager working on oyster reef restoration based here at Port Stephens. Today I'll be co-presenting with Victoria Cole, who is a fisheries scientist also based in Port Stephens. And together we worked on a project to trial oyster reef restoration that was conducted here in the Port Stephens estuary, as you can tell from the opening slide. And I will dive into this presentation. Hope you enjoy it and learn a little bit about what New South Wales Fisheries has been doing to improve fisheries habitat and water quality while trialing out some new habitat restoration practices. I'll begin the presentation with a small background on its origin. New South Wales recently enacted a new marine estate management strategy to guide protection and improvements across the state's marine environment over the next decade. Oyster reef restoration was selected as an on-ground action under this strategy to improve water quality. I'll dig into why on the next slide, but a result of this project origin is that both management and research staff started focused work at the same time during the spring of 2018. This meant that the development of on-ground works was done in lockstep with monitoring designs, which is perfect for achieving quantitative monitoring of project outcomes. I'll begin with a few oyster reef basics that help to provide context for the program. In New South Wales, we define an oyster reef as a multi-layered oyster aggregation greater than 5 meters in square area. Several species of oysters form reef habitat in New South Wales, but this project has a focus on Sydney rock oysters, which are the predominant intertidal reef-forming species across the state. In short, oyster reefs provide structures that serve as both shelter and foraging habitat for many recreational and commercially important fish species. The reefs also attenuate wave action, helping to reduce erosion and sediment resuspension. The oysters themselves improve water quality and drive benthic productivity by filtering phytoplankton biomass from the water column and excreting their waste into surrounding sediments, a process known as benthic pelagic coupling. This process drives large increases in the diversity and abundance of invertebrate assemblages around oyster reefs, which translates to increased fish species diversity and abundance in turn. These outcomes also support other key habitats such as seagrass and salt marsh, providing increased habitat complementarity and diversity across an estuary. Historic accounts and harvest records indicate an impressive pre-colonial abundance of oyster reefs across many New South Wales estuaries, as is shown in this large oyster reef here that sits in the Hunter River. Sadly, much of this habitat has been lost. Unsustainable harvest and catchment clearing, coupled with the likely introduction of new and more virulent strains of pathogens, led to the near complete eradication of subtidal oyster reefs and a drastic reduction in intertidal oyster reef habitat approximately 130 years ago. Today, only a fraction of historic intertidal oyster reef remains, and we have no solid records of any subtidal oyster reefs across the state. Intertidal oyster reefs are exposed at low tides and inundated under high tides. I should comment, subtidal oyster reefs remain below the water level even at lowest of tides. So that's the differentiation of those two titles there. With the formative role that oyster reefs play in estuarine ecology and water quality, coupled with these large losses, it's easy to see why the restoration of oyster reefs has been prioritized for on-ground works through the marine estate management strategy. But the approach needs to be tested and measured in current New South Wales context to know if it can deliver on these promised objectives. To do this, Port Stephens was selected to trial this restoration as it has all the right ingredients for on-ground works. It's large in size, has a healthy oyster industry to provide shell for constructing the reefs, has good natural spat fall, both from wild oysters and cultivated oysters held in aquaculture, and it's in close proximity to the Port Stephens Fisheries Center, allowing for logistical challenges to be addressed. 2 restoration locations were chosen, which has allowed for trial of the works across a range of environmental conditions. One site is located in the estuarine western basin near Karua, and one other site was located in the marine-dominated eastern basin of the port near the Mile River, as you can see in this image on the right side of the slide. A driving focus for site selection was to choose areas that were environmentally suitable, but also met all of the licensing requirements, which means they were low risk for boating and multiple use, were out of the way for aquaculture, and also didn't provide or present any navigation challenges. This was a big effort in trying out this approach because no other projects had been conducted in public waters like this, so that this was the first step. So with the sites having been chosen, the next step is to figure out how we go about actually restoring oyster reef in these locations. What we've done is use the presence of some small amounts of remnant intertidal oyster reef as a guide. What you can see in the image on the right side of this slide is oyster reef habitat that has formed on old abandoned oyster rock leases that were in this location historically. And what we found as we look at this is that many of New South Wales' remaining intertidal oyster reefs form on rock substrates like this, or rock walls or ballast piles. It appears that a primary limiting factor for intertidal oyster reef in many New South Wales estuaries is simply a lack of suitable spat settlement substrate, or in other words, baby oyster settlement substrate. We think that hard substrates were largely lost with the historic removal of reefs, and this fact has limited natural intertidal oyster reef recovery. So in this situation, providing hard substrate for oyster settlement and recruitment may be all that's required to stimulate recovery of intertidal oyster reef habitats. So our oyster restoration treatment is simply to provide oyster settlement substrate using fresh quarried rock and recycled oyster shells. So while our restoration treatment is quite simple, the construction logistics to accomplish it are not. This project had to tackle a considerable number of firsts with regards to on-ground works, most of which had to be trialed and refined while under construction, as there was no way to test them in advance. The biggest challenges center on site access, which is limited to high tide, and suitable loading sites for barges, and then coordinating the timing of loading and transit to these locations with the tidal windows that were required. You can see one of the large loading sites here on Tea Gardens. This is about 1,000 tons of gabion rock here. The barge there getting prepped to load it. And we worked with local contractor M&J Marine, who you can see in this short clip below, did a fantastic job of accessing these sites, working quickly on a short window of tide, each day delivering approximately 50 tons of rock to the restoration locations to build the rock reef bases, as can be seen here, that the tide has dropped out. Construction of the reef took 75 days with an average of 50 tons of rock placed per day, as I had mentioned. That's approximately 4 semi-truck loads. 3,300 tons of rock and 180 cubic meters of oyster shell were used in the build, which is enough to raise an international football pitch by 1 meter. And we had an excellent project outcome, with project delivery being achieved on time and within budget. The contract provided 4+ full-time skilled positions for a 3-month period during the project, and the final reef layouts, as you can see in the 2 images to the right, achieved a very natural resemblance to oyster reef that is still remnant oyster reefs in the area. It's located in the right depth profile, and we're really excited to see what occurs on these reefs and see how they progress into natural oyster reef habitat. So with that background and a little bit of detail on the construction, I am going to hand over the presentation to Vicki, who will give you an introduction to the monitoring program that was associated with this work and some of the results that have been recorded and what we have achieved so far on the biological front. Thank you.
Our research started off by developing goals for oyster reef restoration in Port Stephens. Also, we're understanding the ecological variability in remnant oyster reefs. We did a small pilot study to see if locally sourced rock or clean shell was best for recruitment. The main part of our work is to experimentally test if oyster reef restoration is successful. We focused on natural settlement of Sydney rock oysters. Women oyster reefs in Port Stephens are generally either natural reefs or historic rock leases like in this video. We use them to test two different types of restoration. In the Western Basin, we tested augmentation of an old rock lease. In the Eastern Basin, we tested construction of a new oyster reef. Our research was focused on the short and longer-term ecological benefits of oyster reefs through pre- and post-construction monitoring of oysters, invertebrates, and fish. Here you can see we sampled two oyster reef restoration sites, two sediment control sites, and the restoration site. We had an experimental design which consisted of before and after sampling twice in each season. In the Western Basin, we had historic rock leases that were untouched as the controls and a site where rock and shell were added for the restoration. In the Eastern Basin, we had construction of a new oyster reef, which was compared with sandy substrata controls and remnant oyster reef sites. For each time at each site, we sampled 6 replicate cores of invertebrates and 3 browse for fishes. In this talk, I'm just going to focus on the Eastern Basin. Here, this type of graph shows that more similar samples in terms of the numbers and types of species are closer. So over here, we observe 38 species of invertebrates, mostly snails, bivalves, crabs, amphipods, and worms. It's pretty clear that the assemblages of species in the Oyster Reef reference sites, which are the light blue shapes, are different from the control sediment sites, which are red, and also the restoration site in dark blue. For this in the following graphs, again the light blue are the reference Oyster Reef sites, and the control bare sites are in red, and the dark blue is the restoration site. In terms of the total number of individuals, which are all the different invertebrates, we found that generally more in the oyster reef sites than in the sediment. Mollusks showed a clear pattern of more in the oyster reefs, including the snail, the Bicimolraton. You can see here there were lots more in the oyster reefs than in the bare sediment. We also found a similar pattern for the worm Silus prolifera, with more in the oyster reefs than in the bare sand. We sampled fishes with underwater cameras, and previous research has shown that mini browns, as they're called, are successful for sampling fishes in intertidal and complex habitats. They're basically GoPros on small weighted frames that are baited with pilchards. Over the year, we identified 52 species, with bream, glassfish, blennies, gobies, rays, and whiting being the most abundant. Oyster reefs had more species than sand, and this was pretty consistent throughout the year. After a year of pre-monitoring and lots of work putting in the rock, as Coach explained, now we are monitoring the change towards getting an oyster reef that is restored. After 4 months, there has been considerable recruitment of Sydney rock oysters, and some are already quite large. The goal for these baby rock oysters is to grow into established oyster reefs. Although it's going to take some time for all the associated invertebrates to colonize the oyster reef, fishes are responding quite quickly to the on-ground works. So if we focus on the dark blue shapes of the restoration site, you see the assemblages prior to the on-ground works are the squares. And with the addition of rock and shell, they're shown by the diamonds. The restoration assemblages are becoming more similar to the assemblages in oyster reefs, represented by the light blue, and becoming more different from the control and the pre-restoration sites. With the addition of rock and shell, bream numbers have increased early this year, and by March the restoration site has similar numbers to those detected in the oyster reefs. So that's really exciting. Finally, I'm just going to share with you some experiments that we're doing. They're comparing the filtration or the ability of oysters to clean our water. And what we found was that the established oyster reefs are being compared to the new restoration site, and that already got some quite promising results, that we're detecting ecological functioning due to the restoration works. So you see here, the restoration site is already filtering quite a large volume of water compared to natural oyster reefs. So New South Wales' biggest oyster reef restoration project has shown that despite spatial and temporal variability, the on-ground works have noticeable impacts on the oysters themselves, their filtration, and the fishes, and hopefully soon also the associated invertebrates. So please stay tuned for some exciting results to come. This work was made possible due to the assistance in the field from Kirk and many technicians. We're part of Team Oyster Reef Restoration, led by Carly Russell. Please don't hesitate to contact either myself or Kirk for further details. Thank you.